my techniques that I use every day when I'm creating my furniture, and essentially it's about how I can get the smoothest finish possible. I call it Brushstroke-Free. Probably that isn't quite accurate, but it's as smooth as you're going to get without cracking open the spray gun. And I actually prefer to work this way. I find it easier to set up for. There's not so much prep in terms of masking, ironically. Getting a piece of furniture ready to spray takes a long time because you've got to make sure there's nothing that's going to get on any other parts of the piece. So I find this actually quicker, more convenient, and the great thing about it is it doesn't cost an awful lot of money to use the techniques that I use. I don't use expensive brushes, so I'll show you what I do use and give it a go. Don't have to necessarily follow what I do. You might in the future decide to go down the expensive brush route, give those a go. Everybody's different, and what works for them, you know, is a personal thing. But if there's something in this that can help you, if you're finding that you're getting brush strokes with your painting, or you're just a bit nervous to start, then hopefully there's some help within this video. So, one of the key things for me for getting a smoother finish as possible, what I call a modern furniture painting, I call it, a really smooth, crisp finish, is to make sure to pick a synthetic brush. So most of the paints that we'll be using as furniture painters these days are water-based. So water-based paints are best used with synthetic fibres, synthetic filaments in a brush, rather than a natural bristle brush, which you might have come across with chalk paint, for example, or for waxing. Now those are going to give you texture. So if you want to get a smooth finish, you need to get a really soft brush. So when I started out, I would get brushes from the DIY shops, and I still used to see sort of quite a bit of texture in my painting, and I didn't like it. So I kept looking, and eventually I came across a kind of brush that I use exclusively now, and I always use it in my workshops, and I think it's a great way for people to get started as well. If they're not used to how much to load on a brush, this kind of brush really helps them. So I've got some here. These are the brushes that I use, and they're actually, and there's another one here. These are in a set. This one's a slightly different one, but they're all made from a fibre called gold Tacklon, which is actually a watercolour brush. So these ones are what are called large area watercolour brushes. So you can imagine doing a sky, you've got to do loads and loads of, so we'll cover a large area, loads of colour at once. That's what you would use these for. This is just a simple 1-inch square artist brush, but it's gold Tacklon again. And if you've ever felt anything like this, you'll know how soft it is, or maybe you get hold of them, you'll see the difference and how fine the filaments are. So that really helps to get a really nice smooth finish. But also, look how narrow they are. They hold a lot less paint. So now you know people use different kind of shaped brushes. It's as I say, it's a personal thing. I find this useful because you can't put too much on, you can't overload it, and then you spend a lot of time having to sort of try and smooth that out. We want to paint in thin coats on painting, particularly with Fusion, the paint that I use, Fusion Mineral Paint. We want to paint with thin coats and build up. That is also going to help you reduce the amount of texture you get, because the more paint you put down, the more you have to try and manage that paint on the surface and smooth it down, and therefore you're going to create more texture. So thin coats, smoothed on, building up. Even if your first coat, you can sort of see through it and you think that's brush strokes. You can see the surface underneath. Even with the second coat with some very true pure pigmented colours, like the bright colours like reds and yellows and that sort of thing. So in the Fusion range it might be Renfrew Blue or Fort York Red. It would take quite a while to build up, but that's okay. Keep doing the thin coats, keep building them up, and then you're going to get the nicer, smoother finish. So these are, I'll just name check these for you. These particular ones are by a company called Royal and Langnickel, who make a lot of brushes. So I might buy them in a pack like that. Just get the light off them. And I think it's about £4 or £5. So you can look on Amazon and eBay for that kind of thing. And I think they're great for, like I say, if you want to get the hang and the flow of your paint it's a great way to start, and then you can always try other styles out as you go along. So another tip for getting really smooth finish to your painting is to pick the right size brush for the surface that you're going to be painting. So if I picked a really small brush and started trying to paint this, I'm going to get more brush strokes naturally. So what I want to do is use the biggest brush I've got. You can get bigger, but and that means there'll be less pass of the brush automatically, which therefore means less brush strokes potentially. Now, as you'll see later in this video, I would actually probably use a roller for these really large surfaces. Anything that's, you know, over about sort of that width. I mean, every drawer front I probably would roller. So this brush perhaps potentially I wouldn't paint with so much. I might go on to using it as you'll see in the technique later on, as a laying off brush potentially. I have used it to paint smooth, I want to get smooth metallics because I haven't had so much success rollering those, so that's what I might use those for. But really, I might generally use these three to hand paint. So this 1-inch one is brilliant for things like legs, like curved legs or getting into edges. Be great for this sort of trim here. So by using the perfect size, I can get the perfect smooth finish. If I start using the bigger brush in here, you know, it becomes more difficult to get a nice smooth effect. So size up to the thing that you're going to be painting. That's my very simple technique, but I say swap between the brushes that you need. This sort of thing is really good for when you get a really thick edge across the bottom. I might even be able to pass across that in one go. So there you go, it's going to be even less brush strokes. Now I'll do a little bit of demo, but I think it's really important to always work with the grain. And I sand with the grain obviously, but I also paint with the grain. That way if there is any texture or any of the wood grain peeps through in terms of where the paint's lying, everything sort of flows in the same direction. I don't try and go in different directions, and then you can kind of see the different layers of paint there. And I would always do them in the same direction. Even if I did like a little edge along here, I would then feather it down and then put my paint over the top of it if I'm going to roller, for example, because sometimes you can end up with a band going the other way visually. So that's something I try and avoid. Okay, so let's do some actual painting. The best way to see how I do it. I always recommend decanting. That way you're going to keep your paint flowing as best as possible. If you do it out of the pot, this is going to get drier and drier over time because the water will evaporate. Obviously it might go through our pots quite quickly, but a pot that you've got around for a while is going to get much, much thicker. And then as you try and spread that with a brush, you're going to get texture. So I always decant it into a tray. Now often, it's a little painter's tray here, a little roller tray. I am actually rolling at the same time, so I'm decanting it for that. But then I'll work out that paint that's in the tray. Once that's gone, I'll top it up with the fresh paint out of the pot. So always put the lid back on. So I'm just going to line my little tray, save a bit of washing up, with a little foil liner. Don't worry, don't bother buying those plastic ones in the shops because they're a bit wasteful. And then, so that's quite handy, I can just chip that away afterwards. I can also fold that over on top of itself to keep the paint overnight if I want to, or sometimes I'll put all the brushes and rollers in, put some foil on top, keep it nice and airtight so it doesn't dry out overnight, because again, that's going to make it difficult when you come to paint. It's a very good point to also say, a problem you may have with the flow of your paint is when you're painting somewhere really warm. So unfortunately it's not so warm at the moment, but during the summer in the UK that's something we might have to worry about, but also in the centrally heated houses, if you've got a really warm room, your paint is going to dry quicker, and so you need to be careful because as you go back to smooth it, you could end up actually lifting paint off because it's started to set on the surface. So a couple of things I recommend in that situation, because obviously if it's warm and you can't do anything about it, you can't go somewhere cooler, and you need to paint, then you need to get your paint flowing. So there's a couple of things you can use. There's a general finishes product called Extender, or there's an Alatrol product called Floetrol. It's slightly different, this one's clear and this one's white. I use this one most actually, but both really good. And they don't dilute the colour, they don't dilute the product. They just keep the paint wet for longer so you can work with it, so rather like you would with glaze. So those are really handy. I just put a squirt in, and it gets it moving. Really good for things like metallics as well, when they start to get a little bit stiffer, to get them flowing again, and maybe the bottom of a pot of paint if you just want to use it for a bit longer. There is one coming out from Fusion, so that's on its way, that will go perfectly with the Fusion paints when they get a little bit older. So, just pop that out of the way. They are really good when it's warm to help you get a really nice smooth finish. So make sure your paint is nice and fluid, like sort of pouring cream. Then you're going to get the nicest, smoothest effect. I would also point out, I have noticed that paints with a lot of white in the base, so white included, but like pale pink, I'm thinking of damask, thinking of like pale greys, and some of the sort of pastel colours in the Fusion range particularly, but it probably will go for other paint ranges too, because they've got more white in them. The white does actually lend a bit more texture, so sometimes I do put a bit of extender in just to make them flow better as I'm painting. Now I was saying about thin coats, it's really important to lay your paint down in thin coats and move on and not overwork it. That's where you're going to create more texture too. So let's have a little demo anyway, show you what I would do. I'm going to pour a little bit out into this tray. I don't wet my brushes. I have wet my brushes when it is warm to help it flow off the brush a bit better. I think it's also really important to keep these really nice and soft, so I use Virasol to clean them, which really gets down to the ferrule there, gets all the paint out. And then I use Fusion Brushstroke, like a little hair conditioning job, to keep them really soft. And then I use little wire brushes to get the paint off the filaments. If there's paint in its filaments, that's texture you're going to be putting down when you're painting as well. So I'm just going to put, literally, just going to dip it in. I don't mean to dip it quite that deep actually, but I'm just going to dip my paintbrush in. There's nothing earth-shattering there. So let's take a little drop here and demo that. So I tend to hold my brush down on the ferrule itself just for a bit more control, and putting the brush down, and it's almost at a 45-degree angle, can you see? So I'm almost using the flat here to paint with, not the tips. Now go down, and I will just go over it a little bit just to smooth it, but then I'm going to keep moving, slightly overlapped. Quite hard doing this upside down, I've missed a bit there. You can go both ways, but can you see I'm just doing it in a line with the grain. I'm going back over it a little bit, but then I'm going to keep, probably maybe 30 seconds or so before that starts to dry. I'll stop. I've got a little bit over there, so sometimes I just do that. And then I'm just going to go back down. I'm sort of lifting up towards the end so that I try not to get lots of paint over the edges. Okay, so it's quite hard to concentrate on doing that and showing it at the same time, but you can see how I've done that. Okay. Now, if I wanted to do the edges and I didn't want to mask them off, I take my brush on its side and I can actually do this. You see, it gives a natural line. In fact, I can just do this backwards and forwards. You can get a nice little line there. Yeah. So it's just using the flat of the brush towards you, and then I'll just double check the other side. Just give it a little tiny tip of the brush. If I get any that's gone around the edges, I might just sometimes use my finger. There's a bit there that I don't want, but I'll show you a technique in a second that I use a lot that deals with any little flaws that you might create, because you know we're only human and there's things that can happen as we're painting that we might not notice till afterwards. So let's just do. So if I was doing something like this, now this is a bit unusual, this draw here. The grain doesn't run along it, which normal, it's pretty normal. So I would be painting downwards here. Now in real terms I would use a roller on this, but because we're showing painting, let's use a big brush. So when I'm doing this, I want to be pushing down to get a nice thin coat, but I don't want to be pushing so hard that I'm pushing the paint off. I want to sort of glide the paint off the brush. So you can see how filled it is there. Just get that in the light. And so I'm just going to go to the top. I can just come from the middle to get to the edge. slightly different technique because this drawer is, as I said, the grain is. Just double check for any bits under there. And then I need to refill because that's actually run out. That's the thing about these brushes being really narrow. You can't actually overload them or put too much paint down. Now, if you end up with, I've got here a line where I've sort of put my brush down in the middle. And sometimes you'll get that if you're doing a full, long area, you're going to run out of paint part way through. What I do then is I just go over it lightly, like that, just with the tips of the brush to smooth it. And you'll see later on when I show you, I'm going to actually do one of my drinks cabinet, so I'll show you the technique of rollering and laying off and how I would paint with that and using the smaller brush because I use that for the sort of edges. I've got a little bit in there and the finger pads are quite useful for picking up the little bits. So I'm just going to smooth at the top of it. So it's a little bit like the laying off techniques you'll see later on, but it's obviously with a wet brush. So that's not enough paint on. So you can see that this brush is actually quite good for this. I'm just going to go up and down. Now there is a little bit of texture here, but that's, I've got the light off overhead so I can't quite see the reflection, but you see, you get the idea. I'm just using the flat of the brush and gliding the paint on, not squeezing too hard. This is actually going on, it's going on quite nice and opaque in one coat. But if I could see through to the wood underneath, but I know that I've got one thin layer on, I would just leave that, leave it to dry and come back. So I've passed over it a few times there, but you need to just stop. Knowing that you're going to build up the layers, and also you can do a little light sand between layers. So if there is anything that you look back and you think, oh, I can see a little bit of a brush stroke or a bit of movement there, or I've left a little blob or there's a bit of grit or something, I sand between each layer of paint, each coat of paint. So I'm just going to do, so see those layers there, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to going to pop some close-ups in so we can see what I'm doing in a bit more detail. Okay, so that's one coat on the drawers. So I usually would recoat as soon as that's touch dry. So you should find within 20-30 minutes that you can get another coat on. I would usually put 3 on, even with colours that cover in 2, I usually put 3 on. The first coat is going to stick quite well to the old finish or the fresh surface, and then you've got sort of building up those layers of resilience on top. So that's what I would normally do. And then once my coat is dry, you can see there, that one's dry. It's got a little bit of extra sheen in the middle because it's just that very first coat. So as that builds up, that'll get a nice little even sheen across there. But you can see how nice and smooth that is already. Just needs that finish to build up as I add more layers. So what I'll do is I'll take a fine synthetic sanding pad. Now there's not too much to deal with there, but if there's any little lumps or bumps, I'll just give it a quick goes over, and then you can pay a bit of attention to any extra bits you need to on there. You may take the paint back through again, but you don't want any lumps or bumps to here, so you're going to give them some attention. You can go up to a more coarse synthetic sanding pad. Definitely recommend you use these. Not sandpaper, it's just too harsh, too scratchy. And then I'll get a tap cloth, which I'll show you a bit more in the next video as well, because I'll be using this quite a lot, and just take off the light sanding dust like that, like so. And then that's ready to go again. So now the only times you might find that a little bit different are, well, when it's very warm, it's going to dry very quickly, as we've said. So anything over about 20 degrees, I find it goes really quickly, the drying. So you need to get somewhere cooler if you can, or extend your paint with a conditioner like Floetrol, or the extender from General Finishes. But when it's really humid in the air, now that doesn't necessarily mean hot humid, that could be damp humid. So anything over 70 starts to affect the drying time of your paint, slows down the drying time of your paint. And anything over 80, I just wouldn't. 80% humidity. I never make a weather one, will I? So I recommend, if you're painting a lot, get a little thermometer that's got a humidity reading on it, and watch your temperatures, because it's not so bad when it's hot. You'll get texture, it'll dry quickly, you might fight with it. That's not the end of the world. But when it's humid, there's nowhere for the water to escape to from the paint. So, because the air's already full of moisture, and it messes up your finish, and your paint doesn't dry properly. And I've had it overnight before like that, before I've realised I've gone, oh, hang on, it's 80% humidity. So those are times where I actually said, just, unless you've got a dehumidifier and you're in a place where you can actually do something about it, just don't paint, because you're going to end up having to take it off. It might go gummy. So that's one to watch out for. I wouldn't recommend painting when it's super humid. So that's sort of like the 101 of how I paint, and what I teach in all my workshops as well. The synthetic brushes, the brushes I like to use, the technique of smoothing in between coats to sort of denib and get rid of any little bit of texture that you've created when you've been painting. So yeah, I'm going to now go into a video where I'm actually painting a piece, showing you my laying off technique, which is what I use for big flat surface areas, because they're really, really hard not to get brush strokes on, and you know, that's where it's going to catch the light the most. So the top of a sideboard, the large sides of a tall cabinet, for example. I mean, I wouldn't. I'm much happier trying to do it with a roller, and then using a laying off brush afterwards to soften that effect and give it a brushed look, and it dries super smooth. So see you in that video. So this particular piece, I'm going to be doing all of the fronts here, and just this inside part of the drawer supports. The whole of this front, this interior here is going to be done. The back's actually getting a mirror, so that's okay, I don't have to worry about that. I might just do the edges, and I will do the top as well, because there's going to be a light up there. So I will do all the base. I think I might be doing these little feet in bronze, but I will give them an undercoat of this colour as well, just to sort of start everything off. And then the sides and the top are all going to be painted. So I'm using Fusion Mineral Paint in Ash, which is a really lovely dark grey, sort of like a really soft black, but it's really dark. Lovely to work with, really robust, nice paint to paint with. Lots of thin coats, that's how we work with this paint, because it's water based, and it gives you a really nice smooth effect. It doesn't actually need a top coat, which is perfect, so no waxing. I actually do put a top coat on because I like to get a more satiny finish. It sort of naturally is sort of like a low sheen matte finish, and I like a satin over the top, just to sort of really bring the intensity of the colour out, but it also helps protect my designs. And keep it looking better for longer, I think, especially when something's going to be used with alcohol. So if you put something down the top, it's not going to cause any problems. Although fusion is pretty tough, you know, putting an extra top coat on it like I do, I think gives it that extra oomph, especially in sort of high traffic areas, and people are going to be touching the front of the cabinet quite a lot as well with their hand. So the two things that I would use to paint this, because there's a lot of flat surfaces, long flat surfaces, I would actually avoid using a brush over that, because I don't want to get lots and lots of brush strokes, or to try and have to smooth the paint out. So I actually go straight to using a roller to get a really nice smooth finish. But it does give a brushed sort of effect, because what I do is I roller and then use what's called a laying off brush. So the technique is called laying off. So you get a little bit of texture with your roller, but then you lightly, with the dry laying off brush, smooth that through. So giving that sort of slightly brushed effect, but with it being a lovely paint, it sort of just levels out and looks really smooth. For the detail, I use a little 1-inch artist brush. So that's like almost like a watercolour brush. So it's really soft. You want synthetic brushes for watercolour, really nice. The softest filaments you can get, the better, and you're going to get a really nice smooth finish. So I'll use this for all these small areas, you know, I want to get the detail in. And actually, as you can see here, I haven't actually masked anything off. Depends what you're working on. In each piece you sort of assess as you go. You might want to mask inside the door holes or the drawer holes on your pieces, or maybe around the bottom where you don't want to get paint onto the wood. Because this piece has got a natural sort of bar on the inside here, that's really easy for me to paint neatly, and I don't have to worry about using up masking tape. So I actually just do without. And then rollers, because you're doing a flat surface, you actually get quite a nice flat edge anyway. So I'll be able to do along the side, and I won't need to masking tape the back off to make sure it gets straight edge. So actually it works out really nice and quick, just to, once you've done your prep, crack on and start painting. So I'll use this brush for the little edges like this. Like I said, thin coats, and if I stop in the middle of a sort of brush stroke, I'll just run the brush across it lightly. I've missed a bit there. Across it lightly, just to get it sort of smoothed out. But once I've applied it, I'll move on. I won't keep going over it and overworking it, because as it starts to dry, you can actually then make brush marks in it as the surface of it's drying. So don't want to play around with it too much. Put a thin coat on. If it's a bit see-through, don't worry about it. Wait for the second coat. This is actually a really great coverage, so that's in one coat. So that's quite satisfying, really. A lot of the greys in the Fusion mineral paint range are like that. So see how nicely it's going on. Worth all that prep. So I just do those little bits, the bits that are a bit difficult with the roller, really. You can do that, and then I'll do sort of the edging with this as well, this sort of thing. Might come back and pick some of this out later, as I said, in metallic afterwards. But let's see how quickly it goes on and builds up. Surfaces. Now, ordinarily, you're probably going to want to start your piece of furniture upside down, so that you can paint all of these edges, and also I would turn it upside down to paint inside here. It's just a lot easier to apply the pressure. Just for the purposes of this, I haven't actually done it yet, because what you really want to avoid doing is putting the piece onto its top. Now, if you're really lucky, you might have a lift, like some of our motorbike lifts, which I would love to have one, and then you can lift the piece up and down, so you can just do the underneath and the top, but you may have to sort of turn it upside down to work on it. So I'm going to generally start underneath, do the legs, do the underneath, get that that all right before I start on the top, so that the top doesn't get scratched overturning. Saying that, it does happen. I do it. So I'll just put a blanket down and turn it upside down if it has got paint on, just to keep it as nice as possible. So that's just a tip. You might want to do that. Okay, so let's take it out. So I'm going to use a microfiber roller. So this is one of the Fusion mineral paint ones, because I use Fusion, so I use their rollers. And all these things I've got in my little web shop as well, in case you want to give them a go. So microfiber, that's what you want to look for. So it's like a short pile. I've got a little mini roller tray, which I've lined with foil. Paint's in there, obviously. And then my laying off brush. So this is 4-inch. This is by Hamilton. It's a good brand, nice and thick. You could use a big paintbrush if you wanted to. Make sure the filament's quite soft. And as I said, this is used dry. Being Fusion, when I dry it through the paint, it actually is going to dry pretty quickly on those bristles. So as soon as I've done one coat and I've passed it over one time, I'm straight in the sink and get it washed, get it scrubbed clean. So I'll load that up. Also got a little bit of kitchen roll here. Try to ration myself with kitchen roll. This helps to keep the bristles fluffy, so that I don't end up with clumped bristles going through, well, not bristles, the filaments, but going through the paint, which is then going to make brush strokes, which is what I don't want. So I'll do it in strips. Supply it on, like so. Again, I'm going with the grain. Just go with the grain. So, because it's quite wet, I could do the whole lot, but what I normally do is advise you to do the strips so it doesn't dry before you get the brush on it. And I tend to hold it like that, and just lightly over the surface. Missed a little strip there, so I'm just going to go over it again. I'm not pushing too hard, I don't want to push through the paint. Just going to smooth it, and then I'm just going to do it across the bottom there where it's gone onto the little, because it needs to get it away. And then just fluff it up. Give you the strip. Turn it around so you can see. Brilliant coverage on this, isn't it? It's just a dream. As it goes from looking shabby and just dusty to really quite finished in no time. Even though obviously I'm going to put more on. So again, just look for where the slightly dimpled finish is in the light. Hopefully you can see how nice and smooth it is in there. Yeah. So, same technique on the other side. Lovely and quick. No masking needed because it doesn't go over the edges. Be careful. A little bit of something there. Slightly gone. There's something just appearing in my paint. What's that? Usually a finger pad's quite good for getting these things off. Yeah, I'll have to say this can dry before you get the brush through it, so it's when I put a bit of paint extender in it to keep it open for longer. Hot days can be a pain. Just gone a bit further over there, so I'm just going to redo that. So, nice smooth surface. That one. Okay. turn the brush over because it starts to get a bit wet towards the end. Doesn't hurt to have a couple of these actually while they're drying. You can use another one. They're only about, I think there's about £3 or £4 on eBay, or my paintbrush, I think it's .co.uk. It's worth getting a thicker one because the thinner ones get a little bit too clogged and wet too quickly. It's the other side, which is the other side. That bit there. Okay, that's it. So I just need to do the inside as well. So I'm going to have to dry, and then I'll come back and give it a light sand and a bit of dust. So see you after that. I'm just going to pop some tinfoil over that to keep it wet, so it dry out. I'll be back for another coat soon. Okay, so that's the first coat dry on my cabinet. So what I'm going to do is give it a quick rub down with a synthetic sanding pad. This one's actually a fine one. You can use super fine too. Just a preference really. It depends how much you've got to sort of smooth. This is pretty smooth on the first coat. So all I'm going to be doing really is denibbing. So it's just sanding off any little bits that are sticking up, any bits of fluff that I've got in there, and just smoothing it. There shouldn't be too many brush strokes to sort of deal with as well. And I'll keep an eye out for them if there are. So what I do is direct to the grain, up and down. And you don't need to do it for long, it's just a whiz over really. Unless, like I say, you want to pay a bit of attention to anything, a bit of build-up of paint or a brush stroke that you're seeing. So you can just do that by giving it a bit more attention. If you've got a really big build-up, just switch to a slightly coarser pad to sort of handle that. Don't use sandpaper because it makes too coarse, it makes too many scratches basically. You want something like this that is softer when you're sanding finishes and is not going to leave any sort of obvious scratches on the surface. So that'll do that. I'll just do it across the bottom as well. There's a little tiny bit of paint there that I want to deal with. And I basically will do this between every coat of paint. So that's enough for there, and then like that. And the lovely thing about those is they sort of mould around the edges, and they'll fit really perfectly around legs as well. The only thing to say is if you're going to leave your, particularly if you don't leave the infusion, because it's sort of got its own top coat built in, if you're going to leave it with no top coat, it's going to leave the nice natural matte finish that you get with the paint. Don't do this on the last coat because obviously you get that slightly dusty look, which you don't want. So you do this in between each coat, then leave the last coat. If you're going to top coat like me, then I will do it in between each coat. Then all I need to do, wherever it is grab my tack cloth. I did have one on the go, but I can't spot it. Oh, there it is. So I'm just going to grab that and just going to open it out to a sort of fresh bit so that I can mop up that really loose, and it's very light, don't rub too hard, don't put any pressure on, scrub away, just, I like to say mop across the surface. You can see that dust there, that gives you a nice surface for the next layer of paint to go on really closely to the first. So that's it, I'm going to do that all over, put my second coat on, and then I'll do the same again on a third, and that's the painting finished. So thank you for joining me for my furniture painting video. I hope you found it useful. I hope within there were some tips that you can actually use to help your furniture painting be a bit smoother and go a bit more smoothly. If you're interested in any of the techniques that I use within my sort of furniture upcycling, such as prepping, stripping furniture, and perhaps masking tape designs, have a look at my other videos. I'm looking to expand them over time as well, so please let me know if you've got any specific things you'd like me to cover. And if you've got any questions about things that I've covered here that you perhaps would like a bit more detail on, do feel free to drop me a line. I'd love to hear about that and any questions you've got on your projects. So I'll see you again soon.